We've got another true-to-life Texas adventure from an early Texas pioneer family as to what befell them. Now this is really the last Indian attack documented in Texas, and this in this part of Texas we're talking about Real County, which is northwest of San Antonio, about 80-90 miles, near Leakey, Texas. And so in 1882 the Lipan Apache struck last blow to the settlers there. Now this involved a family by the name of Mclauren, and the victims were Mrs. Kate Mclauren and Alan Lease, who was just a young man of about 15 who lived with the Mclauren family there. Now they lived approximately 7 miles above the city of Leakey, Texas. And they moved there in 1880, and they were the last family at that time, the foremost family who were outside the town. And so they lived there 2 years without being molested, although for more than 30 years previously, of course, the Lipan Apache had made various attacks in that area. But this happened on April 19th, 1882. Now, Mr. Mclauren was not at home. He had left and gone down to Cherry Creek for some business. That was located below the Leakey settlement. That was a wild and gloomy looking place where the Mclauren family lived. The canyon was narrow, and just below the house was almost a shut-in. In other words, the sides of the mountains next to the river were high rock bluffs, and in time many huge boulders had become detached and went plunging into the river below. And so just above that narrow spot is where the house stood. And there was a little garden spot between the house and the river there. And so this is when it happened. Mr. Mclauren had left home that morning when the band of Lipan Apaches came around at the top of the mountain, and they had stopped on the cliff which overlooked all the valley, including the house. And they saw Mr. Mclauren no doubt leave the house and leave his family there by themselves. Now at that time the family consisted of the mother, Kate, the boy, Alan, as we've already indicated, her daughter, Maud, who was 6 years old, Alonzo, who was 3, and the baby, Frank, who was just really a baby in arms. And the eldest daughter, Mary, was away in a boarding with a family named Richard Humphreys near Leakey, and she was going to school, so she wasn't present. Now, after dinner, Ms. Mclauren took the children and went down to the garden to work. And so it was at this time that the Indians came out of concealment, and about 2 o'clock the Indians came down the mountain north of the bluff where it was not so abrupt, and going into the cabin they commenced to plunder it. Now Mrs. Mclauren had sat down on a blanket to rest and nurse her baby. She was outside by the garden, as we indicated, and the balance of the children were sitting around her. Now the Indians made noise at the house, which was not more than some 60 yards away, but back from the brow of the hill at the base of which the garden was situated. She thought the hogs were doing some mischief. And so Mrs. Mclauren told the young man, Alan Lease, to run up there and scare those hogs off. The boy did so, and he almost ran into the Indians in the yard. And of course he ran frightened, and he was pursued by one of the Lipan Apaches with a Winchester, who fired at him just as he reached the foot of the little hill, and the ball hit him in the back of the head and came out at the nose. And without uttering a single sound, he fell forward, dead on his face. By this time, Ms. Mclauren had sprung to her feet, and the Indian fired a shot at her, hitting her in the breast. She fell to the ground, but at once got up and started to run. Now, mind you, she had the baby still in her arms when this happened. The Indian fired again, and this time she was wounded in the right arm, but she kept on towards the garden fence next to the river. And now the Indians kept shooting, and before getting to the fence, the poor woman was wounded 3 more times, twice in the right leg and once in the hip. And by this time she had told, of course, the Indians, or the children rather, to run. And her daughter Maud was over the fence, and now she held her baby, and she was clinging to life, of course, Mrs. Mclauren. And there were more balls come whizzing by, and once again it struck her in the hip, and she fell to the ground outside the fence, and she wasn't able to rise. Now, it's interesting that the Indians didn't follow them, and they just rather let the lady lay out in the garden area, and they continued to rob and pillage the house. And so then she was just laying there in the bare ground, of course writhing and moaning in pain and covered with blood. You can just imagine the scene. And her daughter Maud was weeping beside her. And all of a sudden, Maud thought that she conceived of this idea that her mother could rest her head on a pillow. And so in her devotion to her mom, she lost all fear. The little girl trotted across the fence, ran swiftly across the garden, past the dead body of Alan Lease, and right through that crowd of Indians into the house. She seized a pillow, and she ran and tenderly placed it under her dying mother's head. Now, it's strange, but the Indians made no attempt to molest her. No, they just went ahead and rummaged through and got what they wanted. And then, of course, the Indians took off without hurting anybody else. So now, all this happened, and so the woman was now laying there dying. And at this time, a gentleman who was a neighbor, Mr. George Fisher, was not too far down the river. He had been fishing, and one of the children came up to him, and he heard her breathing hard on the bank just above him, and looked up and said, "Is that you, Maud?" And little Maud said, "Yes, is that you, Mr. Fisher?" And at once she sprang to the bank where he was, and she told him that the Indians had killed Alan and shot her mother. And she said, "Mama says for you to come quick." Now, Mr. Fisher lived about a mile below the Mclauren place, and so he went, and first of all, he believed that the Indians were still there, so he carried the child to his house, and then he went on to inform his neighbors, James Hicks, Henry Whale, and Mrs. Goodman, of the fearful tragedy. Now, Mrs. Goodman wanted to go back to the wounded woman at once, but nobody would accompany her since the men scattering the news were gathering a force to fight. And now, before they did this, they carried little Maud and Mrs. Goodman to the house of another neighbor named David Thompson. And James Hicks came down the river to John Leakey's place, and as soon as he heard the news, he took two of the people who were in his employ and set out rapidly on foot for the Mclauren place. And before long, he come to Mr. Mclauren, who happened to be on the road beside him, and he stopped him and told him the news. And of course, this involved his wife, so naturally he was fretful, and so they all ran there to the house to see Mrs. Mclauren, and she was still alive, and she had asked for water. And Mr. Mclauren went to the river a few yards away and brought some water in his hat for his wife. Now, she drank this water from her husband, and 3 minutes later she was dead. And they found the baby lying beside the ground beside her, and of course she was all right. And little 3-year-old Alonzo was sitting by the baby as well. So it was sundown now, and so this happened at 2 o'clock, so mind you, that poor lady had to lay there for hours without anybody coming to her assistance. And finally, of course, it did come, but it was too late to save her. And so this was the last incident of this type that happened in that part of Texas, in Real County, in 1882. Now, eventually, the Army got involved, and they tracked these Lipan Apache Indians down into Mexico. They crossed the river, crossed the border. Texas Rangers were there. Mr. Mclauren and his neighbors were there, and of course the Army troops from Fort Clark, who was situated in Brackettville, Texas at that time, went and crossed over into Mexico, and they did recover the stuff that had been pillaged, the clothing and some other articles, to prove that this particular band of Lipan Apaches were involved in that raid. And they brought the person that is the leader of this particular band of Indians back to Texas, and they incarcerated him. His name was Costelito, and they even brought his daughter captive. Her name was Teresa, and they took photographs of them at Fort Clark, and they lived there for some time. And that's all we hear in terms of this particular Lipan Apache and his daughter. Apparently, they must have died in captivity sometime thereafter. But this is another interesting tale, true-to-life account that took place there in Real County, Texas.